Hello ladies and gentlemen, Brandon Cropper here. I would like to answer a question I got from Metamorphy. He asks about altruism, its anthropological roots, its history, where does it come from? So for those of you who aren't up on Objectivism's take with altruism, Objectivism holds that altruism is unmitigated evil. And of course, Objectivism holds that that which is evil is against life, and that which is good is for life. So if the evil is against life, and altruism is evil, and altruism is against life, that's all easy. So how do all these societies on Earth not only function with altruism, but continue to function through time? Over centuries and centuries they use altruism. I mean, everybody in the world has altruism as their moral code. So how do you explain the fact that all these societies came up with altruism? Why did they come up with it? And since they've got altruism, how do they survive with it if it is indeed as evil as Objectivism says? Excuse me. So Metamorphy called the Ayn Rand Institute and said, what resources do you have that I could use? Get some information on the history of altruism, the anthropological history. They suggested the Ominous Parallels by Peikoff, which I'm sure would be a good source. But I also would suggest the Dim Hypotheses course by Leonard Peikoff, the DIM hypothesis. You wouldn't think that that would have that information in there, but it does have information on why mankind had to choose mysticism as its first philosophical endeavor, why every single society on the planet comes up with a belief in religion and God. Now some people use that fact to say there must be a God, there's got to be a religion and God, because how could every society come up with it? And then some people answer, well, if there really is a God, why does every society come up with a different one? But anyways, if every society comes up with religion, why? And if every society comes up with altruism, why? So let's take a look at that now. 3 essentials of altruism that I have to mention right now are physical force, denial of individual, and the exaltation of the group. So it's anti-individualism, pro-collectivism, and the use of force. Now why do I say the use of force? Altruism is a moral code which says that you should act for the good of others. And not only that, you should sacrifice yourself. It doesn't have any intrinsic, it does have intrinsic, holds reality to have intrinsic values. So whatever is good for the group is good regardless of the means used to get there. Altruism can justify some of the most abhorrent and ghastly deeds because of the belief in intrinsicism, because these ideas are right and good no matter what they lead to or came from. So physical force is definitely justified with altruism. Altruism does not advocate the use of reason. Okay, it is not like think it out, reason it out, and then sacrifice yourself no matter what, because those don't fit together. Reason is on one side and altruism is on the other. Okay, Ayn Rand pointed this out. It's easily observable in many different periods of history that faith is on one side and reason is on the other. Now, whenever you have a system of faith, a corollary of faith is force, physical force. The same is true of reason with freedom. Okay, reason and freedom come together. When you have a free society, there's a lot of rationality and reasonableness. Okay, whenever you have a society where there's a lot of force being used, physical force and ruling and so forth, dominated by faith. Any society dominated by faith is inevitably one with physical force. So I'm going to just take that as an assumption. Altruism is physical force in action. Now these are applicable: physical force, denial of the individual, exaltation of the group. These are applicable on any scale. Metamorphy posits the idea, perhaps The altruism we know of today was sort of a contextual error. We start with humans in tribal societies, and sacrifice for your brothers, sisters, parents, cousins, close family. Then as societies get bigger, we never lose this idea of sacrifice. We keep on going with this idea of sacrifice, but now we're sacrificing for somebody in the next state, and that's a contextual error according to Metamorphy. I don't think that's correct. I think that altruism applies equally to any situation, 2 people or 2 billion. So I don't think it was just changing of context that results in altruism. Altruism has been the default morality for every society. But the term altruism was coined in the late 1800s by Auguste Comte, or sometime in the 1800s, maybe the mid-1800s, by Auguste Comte. And it means literally otherism. Otherism. Altruism is otherism. So it's a new idea in itself, even though it's an old morality, if you ask the Objectivists. Altruism goes way, way back. So what is the difference? How do you come up with altruism? And why does every society come up with altruism? Well, when you're first dealing with people, let's go back 100,000 years or whatever, 2 million years, and you're dealing with people in society and trying to convince somebody, it's not a society, it's a tribe or whatever, trying to convince someone to do it your way. But the idea of argumentation and using your ideas and the idea that they have rights and that you can't force them to do something, all that is way down the road. That takes a lot of societal evolution to get there. So the very first impulse when humans are first dealing with each other is to use physical force. Men have ruled women, throughout almost every society in history. It is true that the men are the dominant sex. Some societies, I know, feminist anthropologists will point out all kinds of things, but it's true that men is the dominant sex historically because of physical force. It's true that societies that decide to use physical force against their neighbors survive, and societies which are not successful at that or don't want to use physical force disappear. So physical force is at the base of altruism. And physical force is at the base of all societies that operate historically. So I hope that looks like a causal connection, like a factual connection, the fact that if you choose physical force as your means of dealing with people, you've got altruism as your morality. And it comes in right together. Now, I think that we can put people who sacrifice others to themselves in the ballpark of altruism, because they look at it as sacrifice. They look at morality and life as someone's got to lose in order for someone else to win. Sacrifice. There's a pie, and it's only so big, everyone's going to cut it up and have a piece. You can't make a bigger pie. That's the view that they have. So we've had altruism throughout history because of the fact that the first impulse is to use physical force in dealing with other people. Faith and force are correlated. So then you have altruism. It just happens just like that. It's as easy and simple as that. In the context of altruism, the Greeks were the first society in history to challenge it. And what did the Greeks come up with? Reason and freedom. They were rational individualists. So they challenged altruism because of the type of values, and they didn't even know about altruism, right? Because altruism as a word is coming 2,500 years later. So the Greeks are clueless about what altruism is, but they rebel against it. They believe in reason and freedom and individualism. Now, the Greeks are the basis of modern Western society. I assume Metamorphy realizes how important the Greeks are to our society, the Western world. The Oriental way of life, the Oriental state, and denial of the individual, and then the Buddhism jig where, the self is a nothing, and you contemplate on the nothingness of everything and the void. All of that is a denial of reality. All of that is bizarre. That's the Eastern tradition, but the Western tradition goes back to Greece, which is rationality, individuality, and freedom. The Greeks rebelled against altruism. Now, Metamorphy says, how does altruism survive? How does it continue to survive? Does it? Is that true? Does altruism survive? Because look at the fact that the Greeks rebelled against altruism. They created the greatest society, the freest society in ancient history. And when the philosophy of Aristotle was conveyed to the founding fathers of the United States, to John Locke and then the founding fathers, we come up with this fantastic, fabulous system of freedom, rights, individualism, and altruism is out the window. Now, I'll just mention real quick, we've had this brain evolutionarily for over 100,000 years. Mankind has had this genetic brain. A man from 100,000 years ago could be brought to today and clothed, and he could learn, several languages and, get a job. Genetically, we've had this, what we are today, for 100,000 years, give or take some. Why have we only had civilization itself in the last 8,000 years? Why is the oldest form of writing that we know of 7,000 years old, or 6,000, or whatever it is? That is because altruism ruled those societies. And they subsisted on the edge of starvation century after century after century. Not until the Greeks did we have the possibility of a fantastic explosion of technology and survivability and quality of life for humans. Now, the Greeks had their two eminent philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and Plato's philosophy being diametrically opposed to Aristotle. Plato's philosophy won out in their first duel. Plato's philosophy morphed into Christianity and thereafter Islam. Plato's philosophy brought the Dark Ages. So it's a shame that Aristotle's philosophy isn't the one that took place, or we would have the Industrial Revolution, before Christ was born. But that's how it happened. And look at the fact then that human society drags its feet on the edge of starvation for centuries and centuries, and then when Aristotle's philosophy takes over, it comes to Europe in the 1200s. By the 1500s, we've got the scientific revolution and the Renaissance. Here comes the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, and the birth of the United States of America. The United States of America in the world today is the most powerful nation on the earth, and the most powerful nation in history, far and away. And we're not altruists, we are, and we're getting more and more altruistic. We got to save this country from it, though. But the impulse the original founding fathers brought us on was reason and individualism, not altruism. So how does altruism survive in history? It survives because there's nothing else. And not only that, but it doesn't really survive very well. Those societies just mumble along, and then they collapse, and the people who are left surviving have to pick up and do something else, or just sit there in a dark age for a while. So these societies don't survive. They don't, last long term. Altruism is not a successful morality or way of dealing with the world. And remember that physical force as such is the essence of altruism. So if you have a society that uses physical force, that uses faith, that's based on altruism, in all respects is going to be unproductive and short-lived. Now, let's look very quickly in the modern world at an example of this. Soviet Union was altruism in practice. So was Nazi Germany. Now, in World War II, Soviet Union and Nazi Germany both raped the countries that they took. They shipped home factories and machines and scientists and trained laborers and all kinds of things. While the United States was shipping factories and trained people and materials, all kinds of things, to other countries. The altruist nations are poor, they're unproductive, they can't produce anything, they have nothing, and they have to rape and pillage to get wealth. And you would be surprised if you learned the history of Russian industrialization. Everyone thinks Russia industrialized under communism. Well, it industrialized using machinery from the United States, Germany, Japan, France, and Italy. And Germany did a lot of its rebuilding in the 20s and 30s with machinery from America. So pretty much all this comes from the United States of America. So Russia was very unproductive, and you'd be surprised how many of their steel mills and chemical plants and other things like that were built by the United States of America for World War II, and were still in service being used 50 years later when that nation disintegrated and fell apart, because they are not productive, they have nothing. They can produce nothing. So one more anecdote about Russia, and we can go on and look at a couple other things. Russia, being altruistic, based on faith and force, and simply supplanted the idea of sacrificing yourself to God and said you need to sacrifice yourself to society. So this society, Russia, couldn't feed itself. It's widely known. They had to purchase grain decade after decade. But what's interesting is that a large portion of their food in Russia was herring from the Arctic Ocean. Way too much of their food was herring from the Arctic Ocean. Oftentimes in many cities that's all you could get was canned herring. And it's interesting that that shows you what altruism can do with industry and technology. Nothing. Altruism can do nothing with industry and technology. Altruists with steel mills and transcontinental railroads and space flight and a space station and rockets and nuclear bombs has to fish out of the ocean to survive. They were hunter-gatherers. They literally were surviving off of the bounty of nature. So the idea that altruism is productive in any way is definitely not true. And the longer, I mean, the more altruistic a society is, the less productive it is. Without the United States of America here, Russia going into its system of communism would have collapsed into a medieval society in no time. But they had Western countries to get stuff from. Food, for example, and machinery, and fuel, technology, updates in technology, new patents, and so forth. So Metamorphy asks, how does altruism survive? It doesn't. It just barely clings on. Altruistic societies throughout history suffered periodic starvation. An interesting fact, the United States of America has never, ever, ever seen starvation. It has never seen famine. There was famine in the early colonies before the United States proper. But even then, not too much after they figured out that they couldn't be collectivist in their little communes. They had to be individually responsible. So the United States is the antithesis of altruism. We are productive and we don't have famine. All other countries have periodic famine in history. Altruism doesn't survive. And it is going out of style. Right? Altruistic societies based on faith and force, are decreasing. They have to, because they can't stand in the face of America. Right now we're up against Islam, and it's going to be the same thing. At the end of the day, we're going to win. Now, altruism's got a long history in the economic controls in Venice during the Renaissance, economic controls on individuals, the peasants, and so forth in the Dark Ages in Europe, economic controls in the Roman Empire. The longer the empire existed, the more economic controls and and a little red tape and bureaucracy there was. And that slowly, in ancient Egypt, the same thing. You look at all these societies, and that it degrades and destroys and holds back the productivity of the society. And it's only by setting men free that you get away from that. So altruism does hamper societies. It's not that altruism survives, it's just that humans aren't completely altruistic, so they're able to cling on a little bit. So, there's the answer to the question. I hope we got your question answered, Metamorphy. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions about it. I think we got a pretty good rundown there. Altruism does destroy itself, is destroying itself, and freedom and reason are bound to take over because the opponents of freedom and reason are on a suicide mission.